My name is Cassandra Reynolds. I'm 27 years old, and if I close my eyes, I can still smell the sharp pine of Sam Houston National Forest and feel the prickling terror that nearly ended my life there. This happened in early September of last year, when my friends and I decided on a short trip to Double Lake, a spot known for its serene shores and tall East Texas pines. We had no idea something far from serene was waiting for us in those woods, something that made us question everything we thought we knew about the world. I'm the sort of person who likes to plan. My friends have called me practical to a fault, maybe even uptight sometimes, but it's only because I hate leaving things to chance. I run a small nature photography blog and was looking forward to capturing the beauty of the forest, maybe posting some of the best shots online afterward. I imagined gentle sunlight through the pines, deer grazing in a meadow, or the glint of fish near the lake's edge. That was the dream. My friends each had their own reasons for tagging along. Naomi Perez, 26, had just broken up with her boyfriend and was dead set on rediscovering her fearless side. She's the type who loves pushing limits, maybe a little too much, skydiving, bungee jumping. She's done it all. Eric Tucker, 27, is the jokester of the group. He doesn't take much seriously, and after the insane hours he's put into his accounting job, he was itching for some fun. Felix Choi, 28, is the quiet one, sweet and thoughtful, always playing peacekeeper when Naomi and Eric get into their usual banter. He was excited about doing a bit of bushcraft, maybe spotting some rare birds. We've been friends since college, and we hardly see each other now that we've all got different lives in different cities. This trip was supposed to be our grand reunion, peaceful, memorable, and relaxing. We rented a battered old RV, cost us far less than any modern model, and hit the highway on a bright Friday morning. Eric insisted on driving. His parents owned a camper when he was a teenager, and he considered himself the de facto RV expert. The engine sounded rough, even as we pulled out of the rental lot, but Eric waved off my concerns. Naomi sat shotgun, fiddling with her phone's playlist, and Felix and I settled in the back, occasionally watching the passing scenery or double-checking the route. The drive out to Sam Houston National Forest took a few hours. It felt good to be away from the city, from traffic lights and tall buildings. We passed small towns, rolling farmland, clusters of pine trees that announced our approach into East Texas. I was snapping photos out the window, trying to capture every moment. Felix would occasionally point out a hawk or an interesting roadside bloom, and I'd do my best to grab a shot. Naomi was rummaging through the RV cupboards at one point and realized we'd forgotten the full toolkit, specifically the wrenches and hammer we might need for random fixes. Eric just shrugged, saying, "I can handle a little adversity." That was his way of turning negligence into a joke. We arrived at Double Lake in the late afternoon. The campsite we'd reserved was a bit off the beaten path, but that was exactly what we wanted. Somewhere quiet to set up the RV, maybe pitch the extra tent for storage or additional sleeping space if we needed more elbow room. When we pulled in, I took a quick look around. Tall pines everywhere, the lake glimmering beyond a line of trees, and only a couple of other RVs in sight. It felt like we had the place mostly to ourselves. Right away, I noticed the campsite's hush. Every forest has its own soundtrack: rustling leaves, the hum of insects, the occasional bird call. But this place felt muted. I chalked it up to my own excitement, or maybe exhaustion from the drive, but even Felix looked around with a slight frown. Naomi, on the other hand, was brimming with energy. She hopped out before Eric even killed the engine. "Let's get set up," she yelled, spinning in a circle as if to take in the entire forest at once. The moment we started unloading gear, we realized just how outdated the RV was. The battery wouldn't hold a proper charge, so every time we tried to switch on the overhead lights, they flickered ominously. We had to decide between preserving battery power or having comfortable lighting for the evening. Felix recommended we start a small campfire, which worked fine. I sent Eric and Naomi to gather some firewood near the site while I straightened out the interior. Felix fiddled with the tent we'd brought, only to discover a gaping rip in one seam. "Cass, looks like whoever used this tent before us never bothered to fix it," he said, shaking his head. Without the missing tools, we couldn't properly mend it, so we decided to stash gear in there and keep all four of us sleeping in the RV. Night fell quicker than I anticipated. The sun sank behind the pines, and the temperature dropped enough that we were grateful for our warm sweatshirts. We sat around the fire, passing around a bag of marshmallows. Eric cracked jokes about local legends. He'd read something online about alleged Bigfoot sightings in the area. Felix humored him, but kept glancing at the dark tree line. After a while, footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind us, and we turned to see a park ranger approaching. He was a middle-aged man with weathered skin, wearing the typical uniform. He tipped his hat politely. "Evening, folks," he said. "You all set for the night?" I nodded. "Yes, sir. Thanks." He gave a half smile, but his eyes moved over us with a hint of concern. "Just be cautious, okay? Stay on the designated trails if you hike tomorrow. Wouldn't want you getting lost." Eric laughed. "I think we'll manage. Unless we run into Bigfoot, right?" The ranger didn't laugh along. "I don't know about Bigfoot, but people report strange sightings out here. The forest is older than we realize, and sometimes there are things best left alone." He said it like half a joke, half a warning. I felt a chill, and it wasn't just the night air. Then he tipped his hat again and walked away, his flashlight beam dancing between the pines. Naomi smirked. "That's exactly what I want. Some real spooky excitement." Eric poked the fire, sending sparks skyward. "Relax, Cass," he said to me, noticing my uneasy look. "He's probably just messing with us. A standard scare for out-of-towners." I tried to believe him, but couldn't shake the uneasy weight in my stomach. We eventually called it a night. The four of us crammed into the RV, trying to get comfortable in the stale heat. The small windows didn't offer much ventilation, and the flickering overhead light only worked when the RV engine was on, which wasn't an option at bedtime. I fell asleep listening to the rasp of Eric's snores, with the haunting quiet of the forest pressing in from all sides. Sometime in the night, I jerked awake. I'm not sure what caused it at first. A sound, a vibration, or just a sudden jolt of fear. I lay there in the darkness, heart pounding. The RV was almost pitch black, except for a sliver of moonlight through the window. I thought I heard something scraping against the metal on the outside. A soft, methodical scrape, like nails across a chalkboard. I listened, thinking maybe it was a branch, but the wind was still, and that scraping was too deliberate. I told myself it might just be my imagination, or maybe an animal sniffing around. Eventually, I convinced myself to lie back and breathe slowly. My eyes drifted shut again, though my pulse took a lot longer to settle. The next morning, I woke to sunlight cutting through the dusty RV windows. Naomi was already up, rummaging for breakfast supplies. She wasn't exactly the maternal type, but she must have been starving because she had a pan out and was rummaging in the cooler. Eric stumbled out soon after, hair askew. Felix was the last to rise. He saw me staring at him, eyes bloodshot. "Couldn't sleep," he mumbled. "Kept hearing weird noises. Probably just the forest." Eric, trying to turn everything into a joke, said, "So we're all in agreement. Cass's snoring is terrifying." I forced a laugh, though I knew something else had been outside last night. It wasn't a question of whether something had actually scraped the RV. It was only a question of what that something might be. After a makeshift breakfast, we decided on a short walk to get the lay of the land. We'd follow the main trail and maybe circle back by lunchtime. Naomi insisted we needed to spice things up, so she kept darting off the path, investigating anything that looked unusual. A rusted soda can, a rabbit den, an interesting patch of moss. She had a habit of ignoring my calls to stay closer. At one point, she went silent for a minute, and I found her crouched by a patch of dirt near the trail. "Cass, look," she whispered, pointing to a cluster of footprints. I stepped closer. They looked like a canine's prints, but larger than a coyote's. The spacing was strange, almost like whatever made them was on 2 legs, then 4, then 2 again. Felix joined us, brow furrowed. "Could be a big dog," he said, not sounding convinced. Naomi shrugged and brushed it off. Well, there's your local legend, folks. The Bigfoot wolf hybrid of Double Lake. She tried to laugh, but the sound fell flat. I couldn't help noticing the faint, rotting smell in the air, something sickly and sweet at the same time. I turned up my nose, scanning the pines, but saw no movement. We headed back to the campsite soon after, each of us pretending we weren't spooked. The day proceeded in a mostly normal fashion. Felix took some time to do birdwatching near the lake. Naomi sunbathed on a large rock. Eric tried fishing and failed. I snapped photographs, capturing a cardinal perched on a branch, a curious squirrel scuttling near a stump, scenic shots of the lake's still waters. For a moment, I forgot my unease. That evening, the tension in the group rose. The RV's lights flickered alarmingly when Eric tried to turn them on. The battery was draining again, maybe faster than before. We didn't have the tools to fix or replace it, and there were no maintenance shops for miles. So, we made do with flashlights and a couple of lanterns. A big part of me wanted to pack up and drive home, but we'd all agreed to stay until Sunday at least. I told myself we'd manage. Night 2 was when everything started to unravel. We built another campfire, roasted hot dogs, and had some drinks. Eric recounted the local ghost stories he'd Googled. Flickering lights seen in the forest, disembodied voices calling from the trees. Naomi rolled her eyes but seemed fascinated. Felix just kept looking behind his shoulder, scanning the darkness. After a while, we settled into an uneasy quiet. Without warning, we heard it, a faint whistling from the trees. It wasn't a bird or the wind. It sounded almost human, a slow tune that carried through the night. Naomi jerked her head up. Anyone else hearing that? Yeah, I said, keeping my voice low. My skin crawled with goosebumps. We sat in silence, listening as the whistling got louder, then faded again. It seemed to circle us, as if moving in the forest's perimeter. Eventually, it vanished completely. Eric forced a laugh. Probably some other campers trying to freak us out, he said, but his face didn't look convinced. We retreated into the RV soon after, securing the doors. The overhead lights flickered a dismal yellow, enough to see each other's uneasy expressions. I still don't like this, I muttered. That whistling, it didn't sound right. Naomi bristled. Cass, come on, we're letting our imaginations run wild. The ranger gave us some spooky line, and now every branch crack is a sign of doom. Let's just chill. But I couldn't chill. Neither could Felix, judging by how he obsessively checked the locks. Eric tried to stream a show from his phone, but we had terrible reception. We gave up and decided to call it a night, each of us retreating to our corners. Sometime around midnight, I heard that scraping again. This time it was accompanied by a soft rasping sound, almost like breathing or low growling. I sat up, heart hammering. In the dim glow of a lantern we'd left on, I saw Naomi stirring too. She mouthed, "Do you hear that?" I nodded. My palms were sweaty as I gripped the sleeping bag. The sound traveled along the side of the RV from one window to another. It paused near the door. I held my breath, half expecting it to open. Instead, it scratched, nails raking on metal. It was the single most horrifying sound I've ever experienced, deliberate and full of intent. Felix quietly flipped open the curtain over a small window by his bunk. I saw his eyes widen, and then he yanked the curtain shut. "Something's out there," he whispered hoarsely. We all stayed still, hardly daring to breathe. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a minute or two. Finally, it stopped. We didn't move. Seconds turned to minutes, the quiet pressing in. Then, as if we'd been released from a spell, we exhaled and glanced at one another. Eric found his voice first, though it shook. "All right, it's definitely not just a breeze." Naomi said nothing. Her rebellious facade melted into genuine fear. Felix was white as a sheet. I tried to think of something reassuring to say and failed. In the end, we stayed awake until dawn, hearts pounding, waiting for movement, for an attack, for something. But it never came. When morning finally arrived, we ventured out cautiously. Eric carried a pocket knife, not that it'd do much good against whatever we faced. The gravel around the RV was disturbed. There were tracks, almost like large paw prints, but the pattern was erratic and wrong. Even worse, we discovered a half-eaten possum carcass near a tree. Its flesh was torn away in a savage manner, innards exposed. Naomi gagged and turned away. I grimaced, my stomach turning. It stank of rot and old blood. "We're leaving," I said firmly. "This is insane. Let's get out before it gets worse." Eric scratched his head. "Cass, I'd love to, but if that battery goes, we're stranded. Might be better to see if we can fix it first. There's a small store a few miles away on the outskirts of the forest. Let's drive there, see if we can get some help." We agreed, grabbing our essentials and piling into the RV. Eric turned the key and the engine spluttered. My heart thudded. On the third try, it caught, and we lurched forward. Relief swelled in my chest. "We just need to keep driving," I murmured. "We'll get to the store, find a mechanic if we can." We followed the narrow road through the forest. The pines loomed overhead, sunlight breaking through in patches. We passed no other cars or people for a long stretch, which only deepened my anxiety. Naomi scanned the trees, looking for signs of movement. Felix sat near the back window, eyes darting from side to side. Then, without warning, the engine coughed again and lost power. Eric cursed, coaxing the gas pedal, but the RV slowed to a crawl. Finally, it rattled to a complete stop on the side of the road. He tried the ignition repeatedly. Nothing but a pathetic chug-chug. My heart sank. We were miles from anywhere, with no phone reception, in the heart of a forest harboring something monstrous. We got out to check the engine. Eric managed to identify a possible leak in a hose, and we had no replacement. We were basically stuck. Felix suggested we hike back to the campsite, gather more supplies, and then follow the main trail to a ranger station. There should be one not too far from Double Lake, or at least a sign that could point us to help. Naomi was skeptical. "We're risking walking around out here?" But we had no choice, and we all knew it. We locked up the RV, shouldered what gear and food we could carry, and started back on foot. It took nearly an hour to make it back to the campsite. Our plan was to fill up water containers, salvage anything useful, and head for the nearest official station. But we never got that far. The moment we approached our campsite, something felt off. The door to the tent was ripped open, the tear in the seam enlarged so badly it looked like a wild animal had clawed at it. Our cooler lay on its side, contents scattered across the grass. A rancid odor clung to the air. I half expected that possum carcass to be right there, but it was gone. Eric poked around, muttering curses. Naomi stood still, gripping her water bottle, scanning the forest line as though expecting an ambush. Then we heard the voice. A child's voice calling, "Help me, I'm lost!" We all went rigid. It came from somewhere deeper among the trees, away from the main trail, in a patch of denser undergrowth. The voice was young, boyish, laced with distress. Before any of us could stop her, Naomi snapped out of her stupor and sprinted toward the sound. "Naomi, don't!" I screamed, chasing after her. Felix and Eric followed. We stumbled over roots and ferns, pushing through prickly branches. The forest grew thicker, darker. The smell of pine gave way to a nauseating stench, like decomposition. We found Naomi in a small clearing. She was standing stock still, staring straight ahead. I rushed to her side and saw what had captured her attention. A figure lurking at the edge of the clearing. At first, it seemed like a person wearing ragged clothing. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized its body was all wrong. Limbs too long, posture hunched, head cocked unnaturally. Its eyes gleamed with a faint yellowish reflection, like an animal's caught in headlights. My stomach clenched with raw terror. It didn't move. It only stood there, as if studying us. Then, in a voice that sounded eerily like a child, it repeated, "Help me. I'm lost." The words came out stilted, as though the mouth forming them wasn't used to speaking. Naomi trembled, That's not a person, is it?" she whispered. Felix, breathing hard, raised his flashlight, the only sort of weapon he had. The creature's face twitched into something resembling a smile, but it was sickening. Then it moved, fast. It darted behind a tree, disappearing in a blink, leaving only the stench of rot behind. In the adrenaline rush, I realized Naomi was stepping forward again. I grabbed her arm. "Stop. It's trying to lure you away. Let's get out of here." The four of us retraced our steps toward the campsite, stumbling over roots, hearts hammering. When we emerged from the trees, we didn't see it trailing behind us, but I knew it was there, watching. We had to think fast. Our plan to reach the ranger station stood, but we were obviously not safe. We quickly gathered the few unscattered supplies left at the site. Naomi was shivering, her earlier bravado gone. Eric tried to put on a calm face, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Felix hefted a small hatchet we'd found among the gear. "I know it's not much, but if it comes at us..." We set off down the main trail, staying in a tight group. The forest felt different now, hostile. The bird song was absent. Even the insects seemed silent. Everything reminded me of the ranger's warning. These woods hold old stories that maybe we shouldn't have disturbed. The path wound through thick pines, past swampy patches of grass. Every few hundred yards we'd pause, listening for movement. Once, I heard the faint whistling again, that same haunting tune from the previous night. Eric's face paled. Eventually, late in the afternoon, we saw a sign pointing to the ranger station. 2 miles. Relief pulsed through me. "We can make it," I said. "We just have to keep moving." We passed a bend in the trail and suddenly Naomi froze. "Where's Felix?" she hissed. We turned and realized Felix wasn't with us. Panic surged. "Felix!" I yelled, voice echoing. He'd been right beside us moments ago, I was sure of it. Eric and I frantically scanned the trail. Then we heard Naomi scream, "There!" She pointed off the path, deeper into the forest. Felix was about 20 yards away, stumbling between trees as if sleepwalking. He seemed dazed. "Felix, come back!" Eric shouted. We broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush. As we got closer, I saw that hunched shape again behind Felix, guiding him somehow. It whispered something in a rasping voice I couldn't decipher. Felix's eyes were half closed, sweat beading on his forehead. Naomi charged ahead, shrieking Felix's name. The creature hissed, a guttural, horrifying sound, then launched itself behind a cluster of pines. Felix collapsed to his knees. We grabbed him, pulled him away, and retreated back to the trail. His pulse was racing. He blinked at us as though we'd snapped him from a nightmare. "I heard a voice," he mumbled. "It sounded like my mother." He shook his head, obviously disoriented. "How could that be? She lives in Houston." We pressed on, half carrying Felix. He slowly regained his senses, but he was frightened, trembling. The forest pressed in closer, or maybe it was just my terror magnifying everything. Sunset was approaching. I knew we had to make that ranger station or risk a third night in these woods. As dusk settled, we heard that damned whistling again, echoing among the trees, closer than before. In the fading light, we saw it, tall and pale, eyes flickering with a sinister intelligence. We huddled together, trying to use our flashlights and lanterns to keep it at bay. It slunk back, half behind a tree, all twisted limbs and elongated fingers. That stench of rot slammed into my nostrils again. Naomi held up the largest flashlight, shining it directly on the figure. It let out a raspy snarl, stepping behind a trunk. In that instant, we seized the chance to dash forward. Fear fueled our legs, carrying us down the trail. Every so often, I glanced back, expecting it to lunge at us, but it didn't. Maybe it was toying with us, or maybe it didn't like the bright lights. Either way, we ran until we saw the small, squat building that had to be the ranger station. Relief crashed over me. We stumbled to the door, banging on it with everything we had. After what felt like an eternity, the same ranger from before opened up. He took one look at our faces and stepped aside to let us in. We spilled our story in breathless fragments, scratches on the RV, footprints, that monstrous figure, the luring voices. He listened quietly, jaw set, then let out a weary sigh. I've heard similar stories from folks once in a blue moon. Some say it's a spirit or a shapeshifter. Others swear it's a demon. Whatever it is, it's not good. Please help us, Eric said. Our RV is basically dead. The ranger nodded. I can radio for a tow truck and some help. You can stay here until morning. I wouldn't recommend going back out there in the dark. He locked the door behind us, then turned off the station's main lights, leaving only a desk lamp. If it's hunting, best not to draw attention. We huddled in the corner, exhausted and terrified. The ranger placed blankets around us, offered some water, and stepped into a back room to make calls on a landline. Felix had a small gash on his arm, probably from the underbrush, and the ranger gave him a bandage. We tried to rest, but tension made that impossible. Sometime after midnight, I heard the whistling again, faint but unmistakable, drifting around the building. We pressed together, hearts pounding, while the ranger paced, a rifle in hand. The whistling circled, then fell silent. I barely slept. Each hour ticked by, painfully slow. By dawn, the tow truck arrived at the main forest entrance, and the ranger drove us in his official vehicle to meet it. No sign of the creature in daylight, as if it had vanished with the night. The ride through the forest was surreal. Everything looked so normal in the golden morning sun. The trees glistened with dew, and we even glimpsed deer grazing by the roadside. It was almost enough to make me doubt what had happened. Almost. At the entrance, we saw our poor RV being loaded onto the tow truck. We hopped into a second truck, courtesy of a local auto shop the ranger knew, and made the drive back to civilization in stunned silence. Felix stared out the window, lost in thought. Naomi was as pale as I'd ever seen her. Eric tried to make a light-hearted comment about the next time we do a beach vacation instead, but his voice cracked halfway. Nobody laughed. We parted ways soon after reaching the ranger's recommended auto shop. Our plan was to figure out repairs, then just go home. Later, I wrote a brief entry on my blog, a vague recollection of the strange happenings we'd encountered, minus any specifics about a supernatural entity. I was too afraid of how people would react, of how real it all still felt. Even as I typed, I could smell the decaying odor from those footprints, hear the whistling that wormed into my nightmares. A week or so after I posted that entry, an anonymous comment appeared. It's still out there. That was all it said. 4 words. I got chills reading it, imagining the hunched silhouette in my mind, remembering its unnerving mimicry of a child's plea, the horrifying grin it gave us. Whether it was truly a skinwalker, a shapeshifter, or something else altogether, I don't know. What I do know is that evil is not confined to old myths or remote mountain ranges. Sometimes it lurks in the quiet pine forests, just a few hours away from your home. I'm 27, and I'm a practical person who never used to believe in tall tales. But that trip changed me, taught me that there are things lurking in the dark corners of this world that won't be catalogued by science or rationality. We escaped with our lives, barely, and we're left with the scars of that encounter. Felix still jolts awake from nightmares about that voice claiming to be his mother. Naomi tries to hide how shaken she is, but her daring impulse to chase thrills is gone. Eric's jokes about the unknown have quieted. He mostly just avoids talking about the trip. As for me, I still have a photograph on my camera roll, a shot of the campsite at dusk, the pines looming. If I zoom in close enough in the far corner, I can almost make out a tall, pale shape half hidden by the trees. My mind tries to tell me it's a trick of the light, but my gut says it's watching. People ask if I'll ever go back to Sam Houston National Forest for another shoot or a camping trip. I tell them maybe, but deep down I know the truth. Even if I can chase away the terror with logic, I can never wash the memory of that creature away. Whether we call it a skinwalker, a demon, or something else, it remains there, in the hush of the pines, waiting for the next unsuspecting group of campers who stumble onto its domain. and that's a part of Texas I'll never see the same way again. My name is Ava Lockwood. I'm 35 years old, and what I'm about to share happened just a few months ago, in early spring, when the Texas hill country was alive with wildflowers and the promise of a milder sun. I wish I could tell you it was all just a figment of my imagination, that I spent a few nights near Enchanted Rock with nothing but a strong wind and my own anxieties for company. But something very real and very old lingered on that granite dome, and I walked away with a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my life. I consider myself a rational person. My background is in design, not the paranormal. Yet there are sights and sounds we can't always explain, and that doesn't make them any less true. I'd bought a used RV a year earlier, after finalizing my divorce, determined to prove that I could roam the back roads without fear. It was a small, somewhat battered vehicle, but I'd refurbished it with my own hands, painting the cabinets a cheerful teal and sewing new curtains from thick, desert-patterned fabric. I named her Ruby for her scratched red exterior. For months, I'd made short trips here and there, testing her limits and my own. When I arrived in Fredericksburg, my plan was simple. Spend 3 nights camping at Enchanted Rock State Natural Area. The famed pink granite dome rises out of the hill country, and plenty of people say the place has an energy about it, spiritual or mystical. It seemed like just the right blend of serenity and challenge to mark my next step forward. I first stopped at a tiny general store on the outskirts of Fredericksburg to grab extra water, a canister of propane, and a few snacks. The store was cluttered with rustic decor, dusty longhorn skulls, handcrafted quilts, jars of homemade pickles. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman whose name tag read, Claypool. She regarded me with a neutral expression as I placed my items before her. "Doing some camping out by Enchanted Rock?" she asked, her voice crackling like old parchment. "Yes, ma'am," I said, already feeling the pinch of self-consciousness about being a solo traveler. Mrs. Claypool took my money and made change, her arthritic fingers trembling. She studied me for a moment, then said in a low voice, "Watch yourself after dark. That old dome's got a history. Some folks say curses that never got resolved." She paused, seeming to choose her words. "Just be sure to stay on the paths, you hear?" Her words pressed a small weight on my chest, but I smiled politely. "Thank you. I'll keep that in mind." I loaded up my groceries and drove onward, watching as the pinkish bulk of Enchanted Rock rose in the distance. The state park entrance came into view not long after. There was a small office at the entrance, and I eased Ruby into a dusty parking spot. A man in a ranger's uniform stepped out, broad-brimmed hat shading his face. He smiled as I rolled down my window. His name badge read, Ranger Olmos. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said. "Planning on staying in the primitive camping area or the main campground?" "Main campground," I answered. "I'm in an RV. Figured I'd go up the summit trail tomorrow morning for the view." He nodded and handed me a brochure. "A lot of folks come for that. Just a heads up. Make sure you wrap up any exploring before sundown. It's easy to get disoriented, especially when there's not much moonlight." I thanked him, then drove on. The campground road wove around brushy terrain, old oaks twisted by time, and patches of bright wildflowers. The red, scuffed sides of Ruby must have looked odd against the scenic backdrop, but in my mind, she fit right in. I finally found an available RV spot, clean with just a few other campers set up nearby. I spotted a young couple in a sleek trailer that looked brand new and 2 backpackers finishing a meal at a picnic table. Everyone seemed friendly enough, though we only exchanged nods in passing. I stepped out to breathe in the warm afternoon air. The rock itself loomed in the distance, massive, pale pink, and strangely compelling. I'd read that the Tonkawa, Apache, and Comanche tribes considered it a sacred place, that at times people reported faint moaning or flickering lights atop the dome. I wrote those stories off as local legend, but I couldn't deny the allure. Standing there in the slanting light, I understood why people spoke of energy. Even from my campsite, it seemed to hum. My first minor disappointment arrived as I tried to set up inside. My newly installed water pump sputtered, barely pushing out enough water to rinse a few dishes. I fiddled with the wiring, cursing under my breath, and eventually accepted that water was going to be rationed. Fine. I had extra water jugs from Mrs. Claypool's store, so I'd manage. Next, I noticed my battery indicator was dipping a little too quickly. I could switch on the lights, but I had a nagging worry they might suddenly fail me at night. Ruby was old, and so was the battery system, so I wasn't exactly shocked. I reminded myself that part of this whole journey was about self-reliance. So what if my comfort was limited? I was here to commune with nature, to rest, to think about what my life would look like moving forward. By dusk, I'd made a small meal of canned soup and crackers. The breeze was soft, and from time to time I'd catch sight of the young couple in the fancy trailer stepping outside, only to hurry back in, as though they were preoccupied or uneasy. I shrugged it off. Not everyone is into the night air. I lingered by my portable camp chair, breathing in the smell of juniper and earth. The sky turned a luxurious purple, then black, as stars emerged. Enchanted Rock was just a giant silhouette now. I thought I saw a flicker of light near its summit, but it was so brief I couldn't be sure. Sometimes starlight can play tricks on the eyes. I turned in for the night. The inside of the RV was snug and quiet, though the battery-powered light flickered a bit. I lay in my bed, a fold-out arrangement that wasn't too comfortable, reading a paperback novel to lull me to sleep. Sometime around midnight, I became aware of a faint scratching noise on the RV's metal exterior. At first, I tried to dismiss it as a branch or an armadillo, but it went on for a while. Scratch, scratch, then silence, then scratch again. My heart thumped. I wasn't about to fling the door open in the dead of night to investigate. Instead, I held still, quietly listening. Eventually, the noise stopped, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep, the question gnawing at me. Did that sound really come from an animal? Next morning, I rose with the sun. The couple in the sleek trailer looked disheveled, as if they hadn't slept. They hurriedly started loading their gear into a truck. I approached them, intending to say hi and maybe compare stories, but they hurried right past me, eyes darting around as if spooked by something. The woman's face was pale, and when she saw me, she just muttered, "We're leaving," by way of explanation. The man avoided my gaze entirely. A few minutes later, their trailer rattled out of the campground in a cloud of dust. I couldn't help feeling a twinge of dread, but I reminded myself that not everyone is cut out for the outdoors. I decided to explore in broad daylight. The summit trail was my first destination. As I started walking, I came across Ranger Olmos checking some signage. He greeted me with a neighborly nod. "Beautiful morning," I said. He nodded. "Sure is. You heading to the top?" I told him yes, and he offered some pointers on the best route. His expression turned serious when I mentioned staying the night. "Might want to keep your eyes open," he said. "We get unusual reports here sometimes. Keep your camp locked up." I appreciated the concern. Climbing the dome was surprisingly straightforward, steep in places, but not too tough. The sun was out in full force by the time I reached the summit, painting the granite a bold shade of pink. The view was magnificent. Rolling hills of juniper and oak, bright green patches where wildflowers thrived, and streaks of color that reminded me of an artist's palette. I spent an hour just sketching the landscape. Though I'm a designer by trade, I love pencil and paper sketches for capturing raw scenery. It's a kind of therapy, focusing on lines, shading, perspective. On my way back down, I decided to walk a lesser-used loop trail around the base of Enchanted Rock, curious about any interesting rock formations or hidden vantage points. That was when I started finding signs that made my skin crawl. A particular flat boulder caught my eye. It had a chalky white circle drawn on it, about 2 feet in diameter, with odd symbols etched inside. They looked neither modern nor recognizable, a jumble of strange shapes that might have been letters in a language I didn't know. In the center of the circle, I could see a patch of black residue, as though someone had burned something there, maybe wax or herbs. The faint scorch mark had an acrid smell. I didn't like it, not one bit. I tried to rationalize it. Some bored teenagers messing around, maybe staging a fake ritual for laughs. But the lines of the circle were too precise, and the symbols too intricate. A chill tiptoed up my spine. I snapped a quick photo with my phone, then moved on. A few minutes later, I stumbled upon a small recess in the granite where someone had placed 3 handmade dolls, each shaped from sticks and yarn, each with tiny twisted faces. They looked like voodoo totems. My heart hammered as I examined them. The area smelled faintly of sulfur. The entire atmosphere felt off, like the air was heavier than it should be. I retreated to camp faster than I'd intended. Though it was still midday, the discovery of those objects set my nerves on edge. Back at the RV, I made coffee using my camp stove, trying to push away the unsettled feeling. I told myself I'd simply ignore whatever weird occult stuff was out there, keep to the main areas, and enjoy my second night under the stars. There was no reason to believe I was in any danger. People do all kinds of eccentric things in remote places. Maybe that was it. As evening approached, I decided to take a small walk near the campsite to watch the sunset. Even with the oddities of the day, the view was breathtaking, the sky painted in amber and purple. Then I noticed something. The lights in my RV were flickering again, much worse than before. For a moment, they cut out entirely. I jogged over, worried about the battery or some wiring I'd messed up. Before I could open the door, the lights snapped back on. I flicked switches, tapped at the control panel, but found no obvious fault. My nerves were raw, and I muttered a prayer that they wouldn't die in the middle of the night. A new wave of dread hit me as I saw that my RV door stood slightly ajar. I was certain I'd locked it. 1,000 scenarios ran through my head. Had a thief wandered in? My heart pounding, I stepped inside. Nothing was missing at first glance, but I noticed a few items out of place. A water bottle I'd left on the table was now on the floor. My bedspread was yanked askew, like someone had rooted beneath it. I heard no one, saw no one. Still, I locked every latch as firmly as I could, suspicion blooming. Maybe the door wasn't the only thing that had been tampered with. Darkness draped over the campground. My nearest neighbors were a pair of backpackers, though their tents sat a good distance away. I thought about going to them for company, but I felt foolish. So I cooked a quick dinner on the camp stove and settled in to read by lantern light. It wasn't long before a new round of noises set my nerves ablaze. Rustling outside, then a faint knock or tap on the RV's wall. Not a metallic scratch this time, but as if someone rapped their knuckles lightly, testing if I'd respond. I turned off my lantern and pressed myself against the window, peering through a crack in the curtain. I could see shapes of bushes, a faint silhouette of the picnic table, and beyond that, the loom of granite in the moonlight. Then, a flicker at the corner of my vision, some figure darting behind a mesquite tree. It was too dark to make out more than a pale shimmer of movement, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. My stomach twisted. I considered yelling out, demanding they show themselves, but something about the situation told me that might not be wise. The tapping resumed, closer now. I listened, heart pounding. After 10 or 15 agonizing seconds, it stopped. The quiet that followed was worse, full of tension. I waited, breath tight, for any new sound. At length, I heard footsteps retreating, soft, rustling across the dried grass. Then nothing. I spent that night in a half-doze, dozing off and snapping awake at every small sound. As a single woman traveling alone, I was well acquainted with caution, but this felt beyond the normal realm of caution. It felt like something or someone was trying to unsettle me, pull me into fear. By the time dawn arrived, a migraine of anxiety pounded at my temples. That morning, I struggled to decide my next move. Common sense told me to pack up and leave, but I also felt a strange pull, almost a challenge. I'd come here to prove my independence, to see if I could face not just the physical hurdles but the emotional ones too. I reasoned that if a person was messing with me, maybe I should tell Ranger Olmos. So, I drove Ruby down to the park's office, though the battery gauge dipped ominously on the way. Ranger Olmos listened carefully to my story, eyebrows furrowing. "Seen plenty of pranks in my time," he said at first, but when I mentioned the chalk circle and the dolls, his face went a shade graver. "We've had 1 or 2 reports of unusual sights like that. Nobody's been harmed, but folks leave feeling uneasy." I contemplated telling him about the store owner's warning and the possibility of a cursed presence. It sounded ridiculous. Still, I tried to put it diplomatically. "I'm not normally superstitious, but something up on that rock. I don't know. It's like there's a constant weight in the air." He nodded slowly. "Enchanted Rock's got centuries of legends. I can't tell you what's real, but I'd advise caution. If you're spooked, it might be time to head home." He gave me a parting pat on the shoulder, a fatherly gesture, and I forced a small smile. But even as I left his office, my mind churned. I was spooked, yes, but I also couldn't tolerate the idea of slinking away with my tail between my legs. Some part of me insisted that if I didn't confront whatever was happening, I'd regret it later. I killed most of that afternoon tidying up the RV and double-checking everything that still worked. Even though the battery was weaker, I felt I had enough to get through another night. I told myself that if something threatened me again, I'd leave at daybreak. Yet as the sun began to dip, I caught myself studying the summit of Enchanted Rock, remembering the flickering glow I'd glimpsed. A thought crept in. Maybe if I go up there, I can see who's been lighting fires or performing weird rituals. Maybe I can even put an end to this sense of dread. That logic was, admittedly, reckless. But alone in my RV with every nerve on high alert, it felt like the only course of action. So, at 11:30, I packed a flashlight, a small headlamp, and my phone. I also took a walking stick, something I'd bought earlier, more for the illusion of protection than anything else. The night was eerily calm, a sliver of moon overhead. As I started toward the base of the rock, I left the campground behind. A few lights glimmered among the other RVs and tents, but nothing stirred. Climbing Enchanted Rock at night was like entering a different world. The granite radiated leftover warmth from the day's sun, and the looming shape of the dome blocked out part of the starry sky. My footsteps echoed strangely, muffled by the open expanse. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, occasionally scanning ahead, half expecting to see a figure dart behind a boulder. The air grew heavier with each step, as though the gravity had increased. My heart thudded with a mix of excitement and dread. I was alone in a dark place infamous for unexplained phenomena. Part of me craved answers. Another part prayed I wouldn't find any. About halfway up, I spotted a faint, flickering glow. It was the same type of light I'd seen from below, a wavering orange, like candle flames moving in the breeze. I dimmed my flashlight, not wanting to announce my approach. Fear and curiosity roiled inside me. I pressed on, careful with each step. The hush was absolute. I didn't even hear night insects. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears. I crested a small rise, and there it was. A small makeshift altar near a cluster of large stones. Candles, half melted, stood in little pools of wax. Surrounding them were the same chalk symbols I'd seen on that boulder the day before, now drawn in a more elaborate pattern, each line swirling into the next. Black residue stained the center, something burned, herbs, hair, I couldn't tell. At first, I saw no person. Then a presence stirred behind the tallest rock. My pulse thundered. Slowly, a figure stepped forward. She was dressed in ragged, dark clothes that seemed from another time, torn at the edges, her hair tangled around her face. Even in the candlelight, I caught a glimpse of eyes that looked hollow and too reflective. My mind reeled. telling me this had to be a real, flesh-and-blood woman. But the deeper part of me sensed something else. She spoke in a low, rhythmic chant I couldn't understand. It didn't even sound like modern language, more like guttural syllables. Then she lifted her hand, gesturing toward the circle of symbols, beckoning me. My legs felt locked in place. My brain screamed to run, but I was transfixed. A wave of dizziness swept over me as though invisible fingers tugged me forward. The chanting escalated, and I noticed a swirling haze around the altar, a low shimmer that distorted the shape of the woman's face. She looked older, then younger, then old again, like a time-lapse flicker. My eyes burned, just trying to focus on her. Overhead, the moonlight revealed a single cloud that drifted across the sky, making the candle's light stand out all the more. The chalk circle glowed faintly, and I felt that if I stepped inside, I'd be trapped in it. I can't fully explain what saved me in that moment. Maybe pure adrenaline or the stubborn will that had carried me through the worst of my divorce. My gaze darted to the nearest candle. If I could break the circle, maybe it would disrupt whatever was happening here. With a sharp inhale, I lurched forward, ignoring the sickening swirl in my mind, and kicked at the altar. My foot struck a bundle of candle wax, toppling it and scattering the flickering flames. The circle's chalk lines smeared beneath my heel. The woman, witch, spirit, whatever she was, let out a shriek that twisted my insides. The sound reverberated across the granite, echoing in the darkness. She lunged for me, but her shape seemed half-formed, as if she couldn't maintain solidity. The swirl of black mist rose from around the circle, slamming into my chest like a physical force, knocking me back onto the rough surface. My flashlight tumbled away, rolling down an incline. My entire body felt squeezed by invisible bands. For an agonizing moment, I could barely draw breath, my eyes watering from the sharp sting in the air. Then, in the flickering remains of candlelight, I saw the figure dissolving. The swirl of darkness receded, pulling back toward the center of the circle as though drawn by a vortex. She let out another piercing wail, arms stretched in a final, desperate attempt to snatch me. But the circle was ruined, the chalk broken. One by one, the candles snuffed out. Darkness covered the summit, and the figure was gone, leaving a pungent odor of sulfur and burnt herbs. I lay there panting, muscles shaking uncontrollably. The quiet returned, oppressive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to stand. The altar was in disarray, candles knocked about, chalk lines incomplete. A residue of black ash fluttered in the breeze. I had no illusions that I'd destroyed whatever ancient force lurked at Enchanted Rock, but I knew I'd thwarted it for tonight. The mental hold that had threatened to reel me in had broken along with the circle. Feeling fragile as glass, I hunted for my flashlight, eventually finding it near a patch of gravel. Light in hand, I practically stumbled my way down the dome, half running at points, breath hitching in fear that the apparition would reappear. The last stretch was a blur of adrenaline. When I reached the campground, I raced to my RV. The door to Ruby stood open, though I'd locked it. My scattered belongings told me something had been inside again. The notion that this dark presence might have invaded my living space enraged and terrified me. But as I stepped in, the overhead light flickered, then stabilized, a sudden sense of relief washing over me. It was as if that oppressive weight had finally lifted. I passed a sleepless few hours, dozing in and out of nightmares in which I saw that swirling black mist chasing me through endless trails. At the faintest hint of dawn, I got up, loaded everything haphazardly into the RV, and started the engine. The battery gauge dipped dangerously, but the engine still caught, sputtering to life. My hands were clammy on the steering wheel as I drove to the front office, not even sure if I'd find Ranger Olmos there so early. He was there, drinking coffee outside the building. He took one look at my haggard appearance and asked no questions. "I'm heading out," I told him. "Had enough excitement for one trip." He nodded gravely, setting aside his mug. "Some places have deeper shadows than others. Safe travels." His words were simple, but the look in his eye told me he half believed everything I might have told him. I briefly considered confessing every detail, kicking over the candles, the shrieking figure, the near-strangling sensation. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I wasn't sure I'd sound sane. I drove away from Enchanted Rock, with the sunrise illuminating the pink dome in my rearview mirror. Instead of feeling guilt or cowardice, I felt an odd sense of victory. Yes, I was terrified. Yes, I'd nearly lost my nerve in those final moments. But I didn't run the night before. I confronted what was up there. Maybe it was a restless spirit from some ancient cult. Maybe a remnant of a witch's curse. Maybe something I don't have words for. Whatever it was, it retreated, and I escaped. Mrs. Claypool's store was still closed at that early hour, but as I passed it on the main road, I thought of her cryptic warning. My entire body felt bruised from the inside out, as if fear itself had pummeled me. Yet I was also strangely proud. I'd faced something beyond any normal explanation, alone, and lived to tell the tale. A week later, when I reached my friend's ranch, where I'd planned to store the RV, I found a smear of black residue near Ruby's rear door. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same sticky, ashy substance I'd seen in the center of the chalk circle. I cleaned it thoroughly, every moment dreading the possibility of a leftover curse. But once it was gone, nothing else unusual happened. In the months since, I've traveled to other parks, other hills, even a few deserts. None have held the same penetrating hush that Enchanted Rock had. None have felt so downright haunted. I've done some research on the area, reading old stories about shapes flickering on the dome at night, weird chanting, phantom campfires. They go back hundreds of years. Some mention a woman in tattered clothes who roams the summit. Others talk about chalk circles and burnt offerings. Most of the stories end with the traveler fleeing, never returning. I suppose I joined that list. A few days after the incident, I tried to draw what I'd seen from memory. The results were messy, a swirl of black lines encircling a figure that refused to stay fixed on the page. I keep those sketches in a private folder, uncertain whether anyone else would understand them, maybe uncertain if I even want to share them. The memory itself is enough to make my hands tremble. I've realized one thing. Independence isn't about blindly charging into the unknown without fear. It's about acknowledging that the unknown can be terrifying and still choosing to face it. I faced something that night on Enchanted Rock, something I never believed could exist outside of ghost stories and superstition. Whether you call it a witch's spirit, an old curse, or a demonic force, it was real to me, and I survived. So now, whenever I pass through Texas and see the pink granite dome in the far distance, I feel a mixture of dread and respect. I think about those old chalk circles and handmade dolls, the hush of the night air, the stench of burnt incense or maybe sulfur. Sometimes I hear that chanting in my dreams, and I jerk awake, heart pounding. But I remind myself that the circle was broken. And maybe, just maybe, a piece of the fear that once kept me bound, the fear of being on my own, was broken with it. I'm 35 years old, and my life is still full of uncertainties. But I've learned how strong I can be, even in the face of nightmares. And if that means one day I'll return to Enchanted Rock, look it in the eye in broad daylight and stand tall, perhaps I'll do just that. For now, I'm content to leave that haunted dome behind me, letting its mysteries remain in the shadows of the Texas hill country where they belong. I have a life ahead of me, and with every mile Ruby and I cover on the open road, I carry the memory of that dark, ancient presence, and the knowledge that I refuse to let it claim me.